There is a voice in your mind that never really stops talking. On Stoicism Breath, we need to begin there, because most people spend years listening to that voice without ever realizing how much power they have given it. It speaks in quiet moments, in the spaces between tasks, in the middle of the night, on the drive home, in the few seconds after a conversation ends. It brings old mistakes back to the surface. It replays the awkward comment, the mischance, the thing you should have said, the thing you wish you had not said. And it speaks with such confidence that you rarely stop to question it. That is what makes it dangerous. Not the fact that it exists, but the fact that it sounds so certain that it feels like truth. You know the feeling. Nothing dramatic is happening. The room is still. The day is moving on. But your mind is not finished. It goes back. It reopens something small and personal. Maybe it was a strange moment at work. Maybe you delayed something you promised yourself you would do. Maybe you froze when you wanted to be brave. The moment itself lasted seconds. But inside your mind, it keeps living. And the voice does not simply remind you of it. It judges you for it. It adds pressure. It takes something temporary and makes it feel permanent, as if one imperfect moment revealed something final about who you are. That is where so many people get trapped. They think they are remembering, but they are actually interpreting. They think they are reviewing the past, but they are really rewriting it through the lens of shame, fear, and self-doubt. The Stoics understood this with remarkable clarity. They taught that we are not disturbed by events themselves, but by the judgments we attach to those events. That means the voice in your head is not some flawless authority delivering pure truth. It is a narrator. Sometimes useful, sometimes distorted, sometimes wise, sometimes deeply misleading. And the real problem is that most people were never taught how to listen without obeying. Think about one regret, not your biggest one, just a small one. Something ordinary. Maybe you sent the wrong message. Maybe you hesitated when life asked for courage. Maybe you let fear make a decision for you. The event passed, but your mind did not let it pass. It replayed it. It zoomed in. It added meaning, layer by layer, until what started as one small human mistake began to feel like evidence. Evidence that you are not capable enough. Evidence that you are weak. Evidence that you always ruin things. The event itself was light. The interpretation made it heavy. And once the mind turns a moment into evidence, the pattern gets stronger. No one else even has to criticize you anymore. Your own inner voice is already doing the job. It repeats the same lines with more authority each time. At first, it feels like self-reflection. Then it becomes self-judgment. Then, if you are not careful, it stops feeling like a thought altogether and starts feeling like a conclusion. That is when people begin to carry thoughts as if they were facts. Not because those thoughts were proven, but because they were repeated. There is something subtle happening in those moments that most people never pause long enough to notice. Your mind is not just storing memory. It is assigning meaning. Quietly, automatically, almost invisibly, it takes a temporary event and turns it into a personal definition. A small mistake becomes a statement about your intelligence. A missed opportunity becomes a statement about your worth. A moment of fear becomes a statement about your character. Not because any of those conclusions are objectively true, but because the mind hates empty space. It fills in the gaps fast. And once the meaning gets attached, it sticks. So now you are no longer just remembering what happened. You are remembering what you decided it meant about you. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Because once meaning is attached, your whole internal world starts responding to it. Your mood changes. Your confidence drops. Your behavior adjusts. You speak more carefully. You hold back more often. You expect disappointment. All because of one thought that arrived with certainty and was never examined. That is one of the oldest tricks of the mind. It does not present these thoughts as guesses. It presents them as facts. It does not whisper, maybe this means something. It declares, this is what it means. And because it speaks in your own voice, you trust it. Of course you do. It sounds familiar. It sounds personal. It sounds earned. But familiarity is not the same as truth. Repetition is not the same as wisdom. And authority is not the same as accuracy. This is why toxic thoughts are so convincing. They do not arrive dressed as lies. They arrive dressed as insight. They feel natural. They feel justified. They feel like honest self-awareness. But the authority they carry is often borrowed, not earned. It is assumed simply because it is internal. And once you begin to see that clearly, something important starts to shift. You realize that the voice in your head is not always a guide. Sometimes it is simply a storyteller. And storytellers can clarify, but they can also distort. Left unchecked, that storyteller begins to build a world around you. It repeats the same interpretations over and over until they begin to feel like identity. You stop saying, I had a bad moment, and start saying, I am this kind of person. You stop noticing a thought and start expecting it. You begin anticipating the same judgments before they even arrive. You rehearse disappointment. You defend yourself from outcomes that have not happened yet. And little by little, you start living as if those thoughts were who you are, rather than what your mind happened to produce. That is where real change has to begin. Not by pretending the voice is gone. Not by forcing fake positivity over real pain. But by recognizing what is actually happening. A voice is speaking. A narrator is interpreting. A meaning is being assigned. But none of that becomes truth unless you hand it unquestioned authority. The Stoic path is not about silencing the mind by force. It is about learning to hear it clearly enough that you are no longer ruled by everything it says. And that changes the entire game. Because the moment you see that your mind is interpreting, not merely reporting, a small space opens. In that space, you are no longer completely inside the thought. You are looking at it. And once you can look at a thought, you can question it. Once you can question it, it loses some of its grip. Once it loses some of its grip, you stop building your identity around every harsh conclusion that passes through your head. That is where freedom starts. Quietly. Not in some dramatic breakthrough, but in a simple act of recognition. The voice is there, yes. But it is not the ruler of your life. It is not the final judge of your worth. It is not the only interpretation available. It is one voice. One narrator. One stream of meaning-making in a mind that has been left unquestioned for too long. And if you can begin there, if you can truly see that what feels like truth is often just repetition wearing the mask of certainty, then you have already taken the first step. Because the moment you stop believing every thought simply because it sounds like you begin to reclaim something powerful, the ability to decide which thoughts deserve to stay, and which ones were never telling the truth in the first place. There's something powerful that happens the moment you realize this. Most of what feels true in your mind isn't actually truth. On Stoicism Breath, this is where everything begins to shift. Not because reality suddenly changes, but because you finally see what's been happening all along. The thoughts you've been believing, the judgments you've been carrying, the conclusions you've been living by, they weren't formed because they were accurate. They were formed because they were repeated. And repetition has a quiet way of turning familiarity into something that feels like truth. Think about that for a moment. How many times have you heard the same thought in your head until it stopped feeling like a thought and started feeling like a fact? I'm not good enough. I always mess things up. This will never work. It doesn't arrive as a question. It arrives as a conclusion. Finished, certain, final. And because it sounds like you trust it. But what if that certainty isn't evidence? What if it's just the tone your mind uses? Because here's the turning point. The moment you recognize that what you're hearing is interpretation, not reality, you create distance. It's small at first, almost invisible, but it changes everything. You are no longer trapped inside the thought. You are looking at it. And in that space, between you and the thought, something opens up. Because once you can see a thought clearly, it starts to lose its power over you. Not instantly, not completely, but enough to question it, enough to pause, enough to choose something different. This is where a different kind of discipline begins. Not the kind where you force yourself to think positive. Not the kind where you try to silence your mind. But the kind where you learn to understand it. The Stoics never tried to eliminate thoughts. They knew that was impossible. Instead, they practiced something far more powerful. They refused to be ruled by them. And that doesn't require strength in the way most people think. It doesn't require force. It requires awareness. Just a pause. Just enough space to ask yourself, is this actually true, or is this just familiar? That single question can begin to change the way you experience your entire life. Because the way you think shapes the way you live. And when you start seeing your thoughts clearly, something subtle but powerful begins to shift. Instead of immediately accepting every thought, you begin to evaluate it. Instead of reacting, you observe. Instead of becoming every thought, you create a boundary between you and what your mind produces. And over time, that boundary gets stronger. The voice in your head doesn't disappear. It still speaks. It still replays moments. It still tries to attach meaning. But it no longer has complete authority. It becomes something you can hear without having to obey. This is what it means to truly take control of your mind. Not by stopping thoughts from appearing, because you can't, but by deciding what to do with them once they do. You can accept them. You can question them. Or you can let them pass. And that decision, repeated again and again, begins to reshape your entire relationship with your mind. What once felt overwhelming starts to feel manageable. What once felt like truth starts to feel like possibility. What once controlled you begins to lose its grip. Not because the voice is gone, but because you stopped giving it unquestioned authority. You started seeing it for what it really is, a process, not a verdict. And in that realization, something heavy begins to lift. Those small moments that once felt permanent return to what they always were. Temporary, light, passing. But there's another layer to this that most people miss. The way your mind presents its thoughts is what makes them so convincing. Your inner voice doesn't sound like a suggestion. It sounds like a decision that's already been made. When it says, "You're not good enough," it doesn't feel like a thought drifting by. It feels like something proven, something settled. And because of that tone, you don't question it. You accept it. Not because you tested it, but because it feels familiar. And familiarity builds trust. Over time, this becomes automatic. A thought appears. It feels true. And you act as if it is. But what you're really responding to isn't truth, it's a pattern. Your mind is efficient. It doesn't want to analyze every thought from scratch. So it builds shortcuts. It recognizes familiar patterns and repeats them without asking if they're accurate. And the more a thought repeats, the less resistance it meets. Not because it's correct, but because it's known. This is how limiting beliefs are formed, not through proof, but through repetition. And once you see that clearly, something changes again. You stop treating every thought as something that deserves your belief. You start seeing them as outputs, things your mind produces, not truths you must follow. And that awareness is where your power is. Because the moment you stop believing everything you think is the moment you start thinking for yourself. Your mind is incredibly efficient. It's designed to help you move fast, make decisions quickly, and conserve energy. But on Stoicism Breath, here's the truth most people never stop to question. What makes your mind efficient can also make it dangerously convincing. Because over time, your mind learns a shortcut. Instead of analyzing every thought from the ground up, it starts presenting thoughts as conclusions. Finished, certain, already decided. And when that happens, something subtle but powerful changes. Your mind stops asking, "Is this true?" and starts assuming, "This must be true." Think about how often a thought repeats in your head. "I always mess this up. I'm not good enough. This won't work." At first, it might feel like just a passing idea. But the more it repeats, the more familiar it becomes. And familiarity feels like proof. Not because it is proof, but because your brain treats repetition as validation. This is how beliefs about yourself begin to take root. Not because they've been tested. Not because they've been proven. But because they've been repeated enough times to feel real. They are not examined, they are absorbed. And once that absorption happens, something even more dangerous begins. That voice in your head gains authority. It no longer argues. It no longer explains. It simply states, and you follow. This is exactly what Carl Jung warned about. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. In other words, the patterns you never question become the life you live. And here's what makes this so tricky. Those harsh thoughts don't sound any different from your reasonable ones. They carry the same tone, the same certainty, the same voice. So how do you tell the difference between guidance and distortion? You don't, unless you slow down. Because the truth is, your mind does not label its thoughts. It doesn't tell you, this one is helpful, or this one is misleading. It delivers everything the same way and leaves the decision up to you. But if you never pause to make that decision, something automatic happens. You accept everything. And that acceptance becomes a habit. The more you believe your thoughts without question, the less likely you are to question them in the future. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin living inside a system you never consciously chose. This is where the shift begins. Not with force. Not with trying to silence your mind. But with something much simpler and much more powerful. You notice. The next time a thought appears, instead of immediately stepping into it, you step back. Just slightly. You stay just outside of it. You observe it. You notice the tone, the language, the certainty. And something becomes clear. That confidence your thoughts carry isn't always earned. It's often assumed. And once you see that, the grip those thoughts have on you begins to loosen. They don't disappear, but they become less convincing. They become something you can examine instead of something you must obey. But there's a deeper layer here that most people never notice. Your mind isn't just producing thoughts. It's shaping your identity. Every time a thought repeats, especially a negative one, it starts to shift how you see yourself. At first, it sounds like, "This happened." Then it becomes, "This always happens." And eventually, "This is who I am." And that shift from interpretation to identity is where the real damage happens. Because once a thought becomes part of who you believe you are, it becomes much harder to challenge. It no longer feels external. It feels essential. But here's the truth that changes everything. Your identity is not fixed. It is shaped by what you repeatedly accept as true. If you accept every harsh conclusion your mind offers, your sense of self will slowly reflect those conclusions. But if you begin to question them, even slightly, that reflection begins to change. And this isn't about forcing positivity. It's not about pretending everything is fine. It's about removing the automatic belief that gives those thoughts their power. It's about creating just enough space to ask, does this thought actually deserve to stay? Because the moment you stop automatically believing every thought is the moment you start choosing who you become. What if the way you feel right now isn't actually coming from what happened, but from what you decided it meant? On Stoicism Breath, this is where everything begins to shift. Because the Stoics understood something simple, but deeply powerful. It's not events themselves that disturb you, it's your interpretation of them. And once you truly see that, you start to realize something almost unsettling, but incredibly freeing at the same time. Your inner experience is not fixed. It's shaped, repeated, reinforced, thought by thought, moment by moment. habit by habit, which means it can also be changed. Not instantly, not effortlessly, but gradually through awareness. And as that awareness grows, something subtle begins to happen. The voice in your head starts to change its role. It's no longer an unquestionable authority. It becomes a tool. Still speaking. Still offering thoughts. Sometimes even unhelpful ones. But now, you're no longer forced to follow it. You begin to notice something you probably missed your entire life. There is a gap. A small space between what your mind says and what is actually true. And inside that space, there is choice. A quiet choice, but a powerful one. Instead of reacting instantly, you pause. Instead of accepting automatically, you evaluate. And over time, that single shift weakens patterns that once felt unbreakable. Because your inner voice doesn't lose its ability to speak, but it loses its ability to define you without your permission. It becomes part of your experience, not the ruler of it. And that changes everything. As Epictetus said, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. And here's where that idea becomes real, not just philosophy, but practice. Most people try to fight their thoughts, silence them, push them away. But that only creates more tension. The Stoics took a different path. They didn't try to eliminate thoughts. They tried to understand them, to observe them, calmly, almost like a scientist studying something unfolding. Not something to obey, but something to examine. And when you do that, something powerful happens. The urgency fades. That feeling that every thought needs an immediate reaction begins to dissolve. You start to see that not every thought deserves your attention, no matter how convincing it feels. And in that realization, clarity begins to form. So the next time a harsh thought appears, pause for just a moment. Instead of arguing with it, instead of believing it, just notice. A thought has appeared. That's all. It hasn't proven itself. It hasn't earned its authority. It's simply there. And in that moment, you have a choice. Not about whether the thought appears, but about what you do with it. That distinction may seem small, but it's everything. It separates what happens to you from what you participate in. And this is where real control begins. Not as an abstract idea, but as a practical filter. Ask yourself, is this something I can actually influence? If the answer is no, then engaging with it only drains your energy. If the answer is yes, then shift your focus from judgment to action, from criticism to clarity. And suddenly, your inner voice begins to transform. It no longer traps you in overthinking. It starts guiding you forward. This isn't about becoming emotionless. It's about becoming precise. Instead of reacting to every thought with the same intensity, you begin to choose where your attention goes. Because not every thought is equal. Some are just noise, echoes of old patterns repeating themselves. And once you see that clearly, you stop giving everything the same power. And that's where your freedom begins. There are thoughts that deserve your attention, and there are thoughts that don't. But here's the problem. Most people treat them all the same. On Stoicism Breath, this is where your power begins to return. Because not every thought in your mind is meant to guide you. Some are just noise, old patterns repeating, echoes of past experiences, automatic reactions that don't actually require your energy. And the real challenge isn't to silence that noise. It's to recognize it. To see it clearly for what it is. Because the more you practice observing instead of reacting, the easier that recognition becomes. You start to notice the difference. Some thoughts lead nowhere. They drain you, loop endlessly, and leave you stuck. Others point somewhere. They reveal something you can act on, something you can improve. And once you see that distinction, everything changes. Because now you're no longer trying to control every thought. You're deciding what deserves your attention. This is what the Stoics meant when they said you have power over your mind, not over outside events. You can't stop thoughts from appearing. Just like you can't control everything that happens around you. But you can control something far more important. How much authority those thoughts have. You can follow them. You can question them. Or you can simply let them pass. And that decision, repeated again and again, begins to reshape your entire inner world. Not by removing difficulty, but by changing your relationship to it. Over time, something subtle but powerful happens. That harsh inner voice you once obeyed without question begins to lose its impact. Not because it disappears, but because you stop treating it like a command. You start seeing it for what it really is. An input. A suggestion. A passing event. And once you stop treating thoughts as final judgments, their emotional weight begins to fade. They no longer define you. They become something you can examine, and if necessary, let go. As Marcus Aurelius said, the happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts. But here's the deeper truth. It also depends on how you respond to them. Because when you change that relationship, your entire experience begins to shift. Moments that used to trap you in overthinking begin to pass more quickly. Mistakes that once triggered harsh self-criticism become opportunities to adjust and move forward. Your mind doesn't become silent, but it becomes structured, navigable. Something you can move through, rather than something that controls you. And from that place, a different kind of confidence begins to grow. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Because now, even when your inner voice becomes harsh, you know something most people never realize. You don't have to follow it. You can observe it. You can question it. You can redirect your focus. And in doing that, you transform that voice. It stops being your critic and becomes your guide. But here's where many people get stuck. They believe that being hard on themselves is necessary, that constant self-criticism is a form of discipline. It feels productive. It feels responsible. It feels like growth. But look closer. Does it actually move you forward? Or does it slow you down? Because beneath that harshness, there's something else happening. Pressure builds. Doubt increases. Clarity disappears. What feels like effort turns into resistance. And yet, your mind convinces you this is necessary. It tells you, if I'm not hard on myself, I'll fail. If I don't push myself like this, I'll become lazy. So letting go of that harsh voice feels risky. Like you're lowering your standards. Like you're giving up control. But the truth is the opposite. Constant self-criticism doesn't create clarity. It creates confusion. Because real progress doesn't come from attacking yourself. It comes from understanding yourself. From seeing clearly what needs to change, and moving forward without turning it into something personal. And when you make that shift, you don't lose discipline. You gain direction. Have you ever noticed how the more you criticize yourself, the harder it becomes to actually move forward? On Stoicism Breath, this is one of the most important shifts you can make. Because constant self-criticism doesn't sharpen you, it slows you down. It fills your mind with noise. It creates hesitation. It traps you in cycles of overthinking, doubting, and second-guessing. And instead of taking action, you stay stuck analyzing. But here's where a powerful distinction changes everything. There is a difference between correction and attack. Correction is clear. It's calm. It's specific. It looks at a situation and says, "This didn't work. Here's what we can adjust." It points you forward. But attack? Attack is emotional. It's vague. It overwhelms. It doesn't say, "This approach failed." It says, "You are the failure." And the moment that shift happens, everything becomes heavier. Because now the problem is no longer something you can fix. It feels like something you are. And when your mind frames things that way, there is no clear path forward. Only pressure. Only weight. Only hesitation. But what if you stopped asking, "How do I silence this voice?" and started asking something far more powerful? How do I make this voice useful? That single question changes everything. Because the goal isn't to eliminate your inner voice. It's to refine it. To make it precise. A useful inner voice doesn't speak in generalizations like, I'm not good enough, or I always fail. It speaks in specifics. This step didn't work. Next time, try this instead. Here's what can improve. It doesn't attack your identity. It guides your actions. And that shift, from general to specific, removes unnecessary emotional weight. Mistakes are no longer evidence of failure. They become information. And when something becomes information, it becomes usable. This is where your energy starts to return. Because instead of wasting it on self-criticism, you begin investing it in progress. Think about it this way. When your inner voice is imprecise, it expands everything. A small mistake becomes a big problem. A moment becomes a story. A situation becomes a judgment about who you are. You move from, "This happened," to, "This is what it means about me." And suddenly, the emotional weight multiplies. But when your thinking becomes precise, that expansion stops. The situation stays what it is. Nothing more. Nothing less. And that makes it easier to respond. Easier to act. Easier to move forward. Over time, this creates a noticeable shift. You act faster because there's less hesitation. You adjust quickly because you're not taking everything personally. You learn without turning every mistake into a judgment about your worth. And your inner voice? It doesn't disappear. But it changes. It becomes calmer. More focused. More grounded. Less like a critic. And more like a guide. Now, that doesn't mean everything becomes easy. There will still be moments when the old patterns return. When the voice becomes harsh again. When doubt creeps in. But here's the difference now. You recognize it. You see it for what it is. A habit. Not the truth. And in that recognition, you gain the ability to shift it. To bring it back to clarity. To bring it back to precision. To bring it back to action. Because real growth doesn't come from being harder on yourself. It comes from being clearer with yourself. And when your inner voice becomes clear, your path forward becomes clear too. There will be moments when that critical voice shows up again, sharp, automatic, familiar. But on Stoicism Breath, here's the difference now. You recognize it. You see it not as truth, but as a habit. And that single realization changes everything. Because once you recognize a habit, you are no longer trapped inside it. You can step back. You can adjust. You can choose differently. Instead of getting pulled into the same cycle, you return to something much more powerful, precision. You bring your focus back to what can actually be done. And over time, this creates a different kind of discipline. Not one built on pressure. Not one driven by fear. But one grounded in clarity and direction. It allows you to hold yourself accountable without turning that accountability into something destructive. You still notice mistakes. You still take responsibility. But you don't turn those moments into personal attacks. And because of that, you keep moving. Even when things aren't perfect. Even when you stumble. And in that movement, something becomes clear. Growth doesn't come from being harsh with yourself. It comes from being clear with yourself. That clarity transforms your inner voice. It no longer feels like something that's holding you back. It becomes something that helps you move forward. And the shift is subtle, but powerful. It's not about becoming softer. It's about becoming more useful. At first, you might not even notice the change. There's no dramatic moment. No sudden breakthrough. Just small shifts in how you respond, in how you observe, in how you interpret your thoughts. The same thoughts still appear. The same patterns still try to repeat themselves. But something about your position has changed. You're no longer standing inside every thought, reacting as if it were a command. Now, you're standing slightly outside. Aware. Observing. Able to see the thought without immediately becoming it. And that small distance? It changes everything. Because in that space, something new becomes possible. Choice. For the first time, you begin to choose your response instead of falling into it automatically. You start to see that thoughts can pass through your mind without defining you. And once that realization settles in, your entire experience begins to shift. Your mind doesn't go silent, but it becomes structured. Something you can navigate. The noise is still there, but it no longer controls you. It no longer dictates how you feel or how you act. You begin to recognize patterns as they appear. You see certain thoughts not as truths, but as repetitions. Old loops. And once you see them clearly, they lose their power. They become familiar in a new way. Not as something to believe, but as something to observe. This is where self-mastery begins. Not in controlling every thought. Not in eliminating every negative impulse. But in refusing to be ruled by them. Because your mind will always produce content. Some of it useful. Some of it not. But your role isn't to accept everything it offers. Your role is to decide what deserves your attention. And the more you practice that, the easier it becomes. You begin to see which thoughts bring clarity, and which ones create confusion, which ones move you forward, and which ones keep you stuck. And from that awareness, something powerful begins to grow. A quiet confidence. Not loud. Not dependent on approval. Not tied to the outside world. But steady. Because now you know something that changes everything. You are no longer at the mercy of your thoughts. You are the one who chooses what to do with them. There is a kind of confidence that doesn't come from praise, results, or temporary success. On Stoicism Breath, it comes from something much deeper than that. It comes from knowing you can handle your own mind. That is a completely different kind of strength. Because when you learn how to work with your thoughts instead of being ruled by them, you stop feeling helpless in front of every emotion, every fear, every passing judgment that appears in your head. You begin to understand that even when the inner voice becomes harsh, even when old patterns come back, even when doubt suddenly returns after weeks of clarity, you still have something powerful, the ability to step back and respond differently. And that ability changes everything. It does not remove difficulty from your life. It does not erase uncertainty. It does not guarantee that your mind will always be calm. But it changes your relationship to what you experience. It makes the difficult moments more manageable. It gives you a form of stability that does not depend on having a perfect day, a perfect mood, or a perfect life. It is the kind of steadiness that stays with you even when your mind is noisy, because now you know that noise does not equal truth. Seneca said that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. And if you have ever lain awake replaying a conversation, anticipating failure, or turning one mistake into a story about your entire future, you know exactly what that means. The suffering often begins long before anything real happens. It grows in the mind. It feeds on interpretation. It gets stronger when every thought is treated like a message that must be followed. That is why the shift is so often misunderstood. Many people believe peace means getting rid of negative thoughts altogether. They imagine that freedom will come when the mind finally becomes silent, when no fear appears, when no harsh memory returns, when no self-doubt enters the room. But that is not how the mind works. Thoughts will continue to arise. Just as life will continue to happen, thoughts will continue to appear. Some will be useful. Some will be distorted. Some will be wise. Some will be old habits wearing the mask of urgency. The real change is not in making thoughts disappear. The real change is in how you meet them. It is in realizing that you do not have to follow every thought to its conclusion. You do not have to sit down with every fear your mind presents and entertain it like an honored guest. You do not have to treat every interpretation as a command. You are allowed to let thoughts pass through your awareness without attaching yourself to them. You are allowed to hear the voice without handing it the steering wheel. That is where real peace begins. Not in the absence of thought, but in freedom from automatic obedience. There is a powerful reminder in Stoic philosophy that the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. But that quality is not created by forcing yourself to never think negatively again. It is created by changing your relationship with what appears in your mind. It depends on whether you accept thoughts blindly or examine them carefully. It depends on whether you let them define you or whether you learn to see them as temporary mental events passing through awareness. That difference may sound small, but it changes the entire emotional texture of your life. As you begin to take responsibility for that relationship, something subtle starts to happen. The overall tone of your inner world begins to shift. The mind becomes less like a battlefield and more like a place you can move through with awareness. Difficult thoughts still appear. Doubt still visits. Hesitation still shows up. But they no longer crash into you with the same force. They no longer occupy the whole room. They pass through, and you remain. That is an important sentence, so let it land. They pass through, and you remain. That is mastery in practice. You observe, and then you decide. At first, this may only happen once in a while. A single pause. A single moment where you catch yourself before going down the same old path. But over time, that process becomes more natural, more familiar, more reliable. You begin to trust your ability to return to clarity. And with that consistency comes a deeper form of control. Not control over everything that happens around you, but control over how you respond to what happens within you. And that is the control that actually matters. Eventually, you begin to see that the real transformation was never about changing the voice itself. It was about changing where you stand in relation to it. The voice may still speak. It may still offer interpretations. It may still try to guide you, frighten you, shame you, or pull you back into old habits. But it no longer gets the final word. It is no longer the authority it once felt like. You are? That is the shift. From being controlled by your thoughts to becoming someone who can observe them, question them, and direct them. That is where real change takes place. Not in silence, but in awareness. Not in elimination, but in mastery. And maybe that is the most important thing to understand of all. The voice in your head was never truly your enemy. It was a tool you were never taught how to use. Sometimes it warns. Sometimes it distorts. Sometimes it remembers. Sometimes it exaggerates. But once you stop obeying every thought automatically, once you stop treating every mental event as a verdict on your worth, you start becoming someone who can actually direct their life instead of merely reacting to it. That is where real strength begins. Not loud strength. Not performative strength. Not the kind that needs to prove itself to the world. Quiet strength. Steady strength. The kind built from awareness, discernment, and self-command. The kind that remains available even when life is messy, even when your mind is not perfect, even when doubt knocks on the door again. Because now you know something you did not know before. You can hear the voice without becoming it. You can face the thought without surrendering to it. You can let the mind speak and still choose your direction. And once you experience even a little of that, everything changes. Because from that point on, your life is no longer being run by the loudest thought in the room. It is being guided by the part of you that can see clearly, choose carefully, and move forward anyway. That is the kind of inner clarity worth building. That is the kind of strength worth practicing. And that is the kind of life Stoicism Breath is here to help you create, one thought, one pause, and one deliberate response at a time.